At exactly 11:14 this morning, the final session of indirect negotiations between Iranian representatives and American officials, facilitated quietly through Omani intermediaries, came to a close. There was no joint statement, no carefully worded diplomatic language, no signals of continued engagement. The Iranian delegation stood up and left. And then something happened that changed the meaning of those 6 days entirely. 47 minutes later, missiles were already in the sky. Not hours later, not after a period of reassessment, not after leadership debates or strategic recalculation. 47 minutes. By 12:01 p.m., the first wave had already crossed into Israeli airspace. That timeline is not just important, it is everything. Because it tells you that what we are witnessing right now was not a reaction to failed diplomacy. It was the execution of a plan that had already been completed. The missiles that struck their targets today were not rushed into readiness after the talks collapsed. They were already positioned, already fueled, already programmed with precise coordinates. Launch crews were not scrambling, they were waiting for a signal. And that signal came the moment diplomacy ended. What unfolded over Tel Aviv in the minutes that followed was not spontaneous escalation. It was a synchronized operation that had been prepared in parallel with the negotiations themselves, which raises a far more serious question. Were those 6 days of talks ever about peace at all, or were they something else entirely? To understand that, you have to understand how this kind of diplomatic channel actually works. The Omani backchannel has, for years, been the quiet bridge between Washington and Tehran when direct communication isn't possible. It has been used before, in nuclear discussions, in prisoner exchanges, in moments when both sides needed to talk without being seen talking. It is trusted precisely because it operates in silence. So when talks resumed 6 days ago, it was seen, publicly at least, as a possible turning point. A sign that both sides were looking for an off-ramp. Even cautious analysts acknowledged that the channel being active again mattered. But the events of today force a different interpretation. Because if you look at the timeline carefully, the negotiations didn't interrupt military planning. They overlapped with it. Think about what it takes to coordinate a large-scale, multi-layered strike like the one that hit Tel Aviv today. This isn't a single launch from a single location. It's a complex operation involving multiple weapon systems, different launch platforms, synchronized timing, and detailed targeting data. Ballistic missiles require preparation. Cruise missiles require positioning. Drone swarms require staging areas, programming, and coordinated release windows. All of that takes time, not minutes, days, and those days match exactly with the duration of the negotiations, which suggests something critical. The talks didn't delay the attack, they provided the time needed to finalize it. By the time the Iranian delegation walked out this morning, everything was already in place. The targeting packages had been refined, the launch sequences had been rehearsed, the assets had been positioned. All that remained was authorization. That's what the 47-minute gap represents. Not preparation, execution. Orders transmitted, final confirmations made, systems activated. And then, almost immediately, the sky changed. What makes today's barrage different is not just its timing, but its structure. This was not a single type attack. It was layered. Ballistic missiles formed the primary strike element, fast, difficult to intercept, aimed at high-value targets, infrastructure nodes, command centers, logistical hubs. Alongside them, cruise missiles followed different trajectories. Lower altitude, harder to detect early, designed to complicate defensive tracking. And then there were the drones, large numbers of them, not because they were the most destructive component, but because they served a different purpose. They forced a choice. Air defense systems cannot intercept everything simultaneously, especially when multiple types of threats arrive at once. Ballistic missiles demand immediate attention because of their speed and destructive potential. But ignoring drones allows them to reach targets as well, so defenders are forced into prioritization. And that's exactly the vulnerability this attack exploited. The drones weren't just weapons, they were pressure. Pressure on systems that have already been operating under sustained strain for weeks. And that's another key detail. This attack did not occur in isolation. It built on everything that came before. Previous strikes had already degraded parts of the power grid. Water systems had been disrupted. Certain defensive installations had been used repeatedly without full recovery time. Each earlier attack weakened something. And today's operation was designed with that accumulated damage in mind. This is what makes it different. It's not escalation in the traditional sense, it's refinement. Every element of today's strike appears calibrated to exploit conditions created by earlier ones, which means this wasn't just planned in advance. It was planned with awareness of how the battlefield had evolved. Now shift your focus from strategy to timing, because that matters just as much. This strike didn't happen at night. It happened in the middle of the day. That choice alone changes everything about its impact. Nighttime attacks find people in predictable locations, mostly indoors, closer to shelters within reinforced spaces. Daytime attacks are different. People are moving, commuting, working, walking through open areas, sitting in cafes, traveling between locations. They are dispersed, and dispersion increases vulnerability. But there's another layer here, one that is less visible but equally important. For 6 days, the existence of negotiations created something powerful. Expectation, not certainty of peace, but the possibility of it, and that possibility changes behavior. Even in a conflict zone, people adapt. They find ways to live around the danger. But constant high alert is not sustainable indefinitely. So when talks begin, when there's even a hint of a ceasefire, something shifts. Slightly at first. People stay outside a little longer, move a little more freely, let their guard down just enough to feel human again. Not recklessness, just fatigue and hope. By the time this morning arrived, that psychological shift had already taken hold, which means when the missiles came, they didn't just strike a city, they struck a moment when alertness was lower than it would have been without those 6 days of diplomatic signaling. That changes the human impact. It changes where people are when sirens sound. It changes how quickly they can reach safety. It changes who gets caught in open spaces instead of protected ones, and those differences matter because conflict is not only measured in damage to structures, it's measured in how it intersects with human behavior. Now look at what this means beyond the battlefield. The international response is already shifting because the timing, again, that 47-minute window, is being interpreted in a very specific way. It suggests premeditation during diplomacy, not after, during. And that distinction has consequences. If military action is prepared while negotiations are ongoing, then the negotiations themselves take on a different meaning. They're no longer purely diplomatic. They become part of the operational environment, a way to gain time, to gather information, to observe reactions. And that raises difficult questions. What was learned during those 6 days? What signals were sent, intentionally or unintentionally, about defensive readiness, about political thresholds, about potential responses? Those are not abstract concerns. They shape what happens next. Because once trust in a negotiation channel is broken at that level, it's not easily restored. And without trust, diplomacy becomes harder to sustain. Inside Israel, the political impact is immediate. The narrative leading into today emphasized the possibility of progress, the idea that talks might lead somewhere. Now that narrative has collapsed under the weight of what followed, and that creates pressure on all sides. Those who supported negotiations must explain how those talks coincided with the largest coordinated strike so far. Those who opposed them must explain what alternative path could have prevented it. There is no easy position, because the reality doesn't clearly validate either side. It complicates both. Which brings us to the most important question. What does this mean for what comes next? Because this moment is not just about what happened today. It's about what today reveals. And what it reveals is this. When a major military operation is launched within less than an hour of negotiations ending, it strongly suggests that those negotiations were never intended to produce a final agreement. They may have had other purposes. Strategic, tactical, informational, but not resolution. And if that's true, then the idea of a near-term negotiated end becomes much more uncertain, not impossible, but more distant. Because the gap between diplomatic signaling and military action has just been exposed in a way that is difficult to ignore. What we are seeing now, the smoke rising, the systems under stress, the population reacting in real time, is not just the result of a single decision made this morning. It is the outcome of a sequence that began days ago, possibly longer. A sequence where diplomacy and military planning moved forward at the same time, until one ended and the other began. Almost instantly. 47 minutes, that's all it took. 47. And that number may end up being remembered not just as a detail of today's events, but as the key to understanding them. Because in conflicts like this, timing is never accidental. It's deliberate, calculated, and sometimes it tells you more than any official statement ever could.